Hi there, and thank you for joining me for today's live reading of Catch a Cowboy by Rachelle Paige Campbell, and this is presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Chapter 1. Stephanie Patricks readjusted her crisscrossed legs on the thick yoga mat, tucking her feet under her thighs and rested her hands lightly on her knees. In late morning, sunshine brightened the studio. Early September brought golden days with a hint of chill in the air, promising the cold on its way. Her noisy inhalation filled her lungs to capacity as she counted to 10 in her head before her loud exhale. The air in the room whooshed as her class of 10 followed along. She smiled as she met each participant's gaze. She loved yoga, both practicing and teaching. She had no choice but to focus on the current moment. During each session, she forced herself to be present and not worry about the 1,000 other tasks on her ever-growing to-do list. As a person who took action, she had difficulty with not resolving every situation decisively ASAP. Sometimes she needed to sit and stew on a problem. While focused on breath and movement, she found a few moments of peace. Pressing her palms together, she raised her hands to the center of her chest. The light within me honors the light within you. Namaste. She bowed, lowering her torso until her forehead touched the floor. She stayed folded in half for another cycle of breath. When she returned to upright, she smiled at the class. The mixed group of men and women from their early 20s to mid-70s clapped. Thank you. I hope you've enjoyed your vacations and that we'll see you again next summer. She swallowed the small lump in her throat. 3 months had passed in an instant. She'd miss her tranquil days here. With murmured thanks and goodbyes, the class gathered their mats, blocks, and straps and exited the class. The yoga studio was the corner room of the spa barn at the Kincaid Ranch. 10 years earlier, the last remaining legacy ranchers, Hank and his grandson Ryan Kincaid, transformed their business from a traditional cattle operation into a high-end resort. It was a big risk in a small town with no tourism. But Ryan had a vision and revitalized his land and herds economy. Within the first year, visitors flocked to the old West town and the business flourished each following summer. She was grateful for the opportunity to practice yoga in a brand new facility with eager students on a gorgeous piece of land. Facing south, the wall of windows flooded the room with natural light, enabling her to turn off the overhead fluorescent bulbs for Shavasana. In a building dedicated to massage and facials, quiet and stillness permeated the entire structure. She liked it here. Teaching was her passion. While instructing adults in the technique of a hatha practice was different from her regular job, she enjoyed sparking joy in others. One of the selling points of her vocation was summers off, but she wasn't the sort to sit around. In less than 2 days, she'd start her 5th year as a kindergarten teacher. She had 1 full day off and was already dreading how bored she'd be. She exhaled a heavy sigh, got to her knees, and rolled the pink and purple mat into a tight cylinder, securing it with her strap. The door shut slowly. Typically, the slam that followed the last person's exit echoed in the silent room. Today, the closing was muffled and restrained. She wasn't alone, but she didn't tense. She knew the mystery person's identity. He wasn't betrayed by a sound. It was a smell that confirmed her suspicions. Mint and leather. She was reminded simultaneously of a sun-warmed car interior on a lazy Sunday afternoon drive and iced tea with the fresh-cut herb from a kitchen garden. Unlike the man, both gave her a feeling of contentment. She lifted her chin, raising her gaze to the newcomer. Her chest squeezed and her throat seized. She frowned. Did that rhyme? Could she work that into a lesson for her kindergarten class? At least then she could turn what would inevitably become another awkward encounter into a positive experience. Ted Stirling, a staff supervisor, pressed a palm flat against the door. With one leg raised and the ankle crossed over the opposite knee, he slipped off a boot. Then he repeated the motion. For a big man, his movements were surprisingly poetic and soft. His balance was impeccable, and his actions, seeking to respect her space by padding across the floor in socks, only solidified what she admired most about him. He's kind and caring. and he's my boss. She swallowed a lovelorn sigh. Her body would do at least the minimal motion. Really, she struggled against a full-fledged swoon. He was so dreamy. She knew better. He'd never direct his energy toward her, so why let her unrequited crush restrain her? She wasn't exactly tongue-tied in his company. She couldn't remember how to think and speak at the same time. In bright white socks, he tiptoed across the floor. "Mornin', Stephanie. Figured I'd help you gather your things and get your keys back from you." The smell of fresh laundry mixed with the other scents, saturating the room. She leaned back on her heels, pressing her knees even harder into the floor. Somehow, he carried every aroma she found most intoxicating in a heady cologne. It was like he embodied a list of her wants. Of course, he didn't know her preferences. How could he when she didn't have the courage to say more than a few words? Under her knees, the solid surface was unrelenting. Not that it could shake the words out of her throat or stop her palms sweating. She opened her mouth, wanting to deliver a cheeky, flirty comment, and grunted. He smiled. "Just point to what you need help with, and I'll start loading your car." Dragging in a shaky breath, she brushed her hair out of her face, her clammy hands extra cold against her burning cheeks. At least her momentary muteness only happened with arguably the nicest person in town. If she couldn't hold her own, she never would have lasted against some of the extra concerned, very involved parents at her school. She lifted her knees and, balancing on the balls of her feet, slowly stood. The deliberate motions regulated her breathing and her pulse. Grabbing her purse from next to the mirror at her back, she threw the tote-style bag over her shoulder and slung the yoga mat over the other arm, straps creating a crisscross pattern on her back. As long as she didn't look at him, she was fine. She could pretend that she was in charge as the teacher and ignore how his thick lashes highlighted his gray eyes, or the deep cleft in his chiseled chin that made him look like a cowboy from an old movie. She crossed the room, averting her gaze, and pointed to a stack of plastic milk crates holding foam blocks and another with woven blankets. "Thank you. I'll get the rest." She didn't wait to see if he did as she asked. She knew he would. That was the sort of person he was. Within her first few years living in Tiny Herd, Montana, she became familiar with every townsperson. Ted always stood out in her mind. Beyond his broad shoulders and good looks, he had a calm, controlled energy she admired. But she was unable to verbalize at every encounter, unless she was unquestionably in charge. The door cracked open, flooding the room with light. She bent and grabbed the crate holding straps, throwing her purse on top. Turning toward the door, she froze mid-step. With his back holding the door open, he waited. She glanced down. He'd slipped back into boots silently. Inelegantly, she jammed her feet into her flip-flops, stubbing her big toe. She winced. He stepped forward. She shook her head and strolled past him. If he offered her help, he'd wreck her. He couldn't be kind to her. She didn't need to encourage her heart anymore to pursue this ridiculous, one-sided crush. Down the flagstone path, she continued to the small employee parking lot behind the building. Hidden from view of the windows behind a row of buffalo berry shrubs, the recently paved rectangle wasn't in keeping with the overall cowboy aesthetic. She was glad for a slight break from the dusty ground. And, although it hadn't been a problem this year, she was glad to avoid her tires getting stuck in the mud during the typically heavy summer storms. A cool breeze shook the dry leaves of the plants. Snow wasn't too far off. She shivered and walked to her car. The little red coupe needed a wash from the dusty gravel roads leading from town to the ranch. Dirt was the least of the vehicle's woes. The back seat was loaded with plastic containers holding school supplies. In the shotgun spot, she set a banker's box full of files and paperwork from the last civic event, Frontier Days, to the next in a week, the annual charity poker tournament. She'd get around to cleaning and organizing the car over the next week. She would unload the supplies in her classroom tomorrow. In a few more days, she'd co-host the poker fundraiser. Then she'd put her event files in her bedroom closet to wait until she was called to volunteer again. In a small town, she could be conscripted into service sooner than later. She didn't mind. She set the milk crate on the ground, rifled through her tote for her keys, and popped the trunk. Lifting her gaze, she spotted his gaping mouth. He coughed. For a second, reversing the speechless roles was nice. until she remembered why he gawked. She was the sort of person who constantly made piles. As soon as she cleared away her things, she started a new stack. Stephanie grabbed her milk crate and strode past, brushing his shoulder as she rounded the bumper. Her arm scalded from the accidental touch. She set the crate in the trunk and removed her mat from her shoulder, slipping the strap over her head. Her cool confidence lasted less than 10 seconds. Ted set the other 2 crates in the trunk and shut the trunk. Gripping the tote bag style purse with both hands, she faced him. He looked oddly expectant. If she was supposed to say something, she'd love a script and some lines right now. Keys? He asked. Duh. She reached into her bag for her studio keys and slipped the yoga studio's door off the clip. She extended the key. He held out a hand, palm flipped up. She dropped the key, grateful to avoid any other accidental touches. Thanks, Stephanie. Will we see you tomorrow night? It's our last Cowboy dinner, and we like to invite all the employees to enjoy the festivities. Our way of celebrating the season together. I promise. No work. She nodded. She'd helped at several of the events over the summer, but never been invited as a guest. Not his guest. He said we. Of course, he meant in his role as the spa staff manager for his bosses Hank and Ryan Kincaid. He was practically a royal we around these parts. The Kincaid Ranch saved the town's economy by transforming from ranching to relaxation. Great, I'll see you tomorrow. He reached up like he'd tipped the brim of his hat. Instead, he swiped his forehead. Forgot I left it at home this morning, he chuckled. Have a good day. He spun on his heel and strode away. You too, she whispered, her words evaporating on the breeze. She walked around her car and hopped behind the wheel. If she ever kept her nerve around him, what would she say? With each booted step, Ted kicked up more dirt. Striding from the staff parking lot to the barn to lock up and back again to his truck, he walked through a cloud of dust of his own making. He couldn't remember a drier summer. The grass had lost its luster by mid-June. He ripped up roots on the dead lawn with each step. In a few days, he expected the environmental impact study about the bison's return to the land in his inbox. He and Ryan needed to review the details before sharing information with Joe Staunch, social studies teacher and part-time tour guide. Joe would ultimately lead all discussions about the herd with the town. With a reputation for respecting others' opinions and understanding the history of the area better than anyone, Joe was perfect intermediary between the ranch and the town. He was the face of the program. The reintroduction of the animals was the right decision for countless reasons, but the community would push back. Change was hard. Ted knew he shouldn't try to guess what the study would reveal. He couldn't stop himself. He was brimming with questions and playing out what-if scenarios. What would happen with the bison next summer? If the prairie grass dried up, what would they eat? Would he have to feed the way he used to for the cattle in the winter, throwing hay off the back of his truck? Or he could focus on one day at a time and be glad for checking one item off his to-do list, getting the studio keys from Stephanie. He had hoped for more acknowledgement than a nod. He was confident in his managerial skills, but worried he put her on edge. Could she give him feedback to improve? When he had started at the ranch, he accepted a career handling animals. It fit his degree and his personality. He never anticipated he'd be in charge of humans, but he couldn't have predicted any of the twists and turns his life had taken over the last decade plus. If he had, he might have been too scared to take even a step. Still, he didn't like that Stephanie was so quiet around him. She was known for her capable, take-charge attitude around town, running a variety of civic events with admirable efficiency. But she never opened her mouth and uttered more than a visceral sound in response to him. The age gap between them was the prime suspect for her discomfort. He was nearly over a decade and a half older. Their different generations spoke their own languages, he assumed. Beyond that, he carried his emotional burdens in a heavy steamer trunk like he was setting off for a new land and would never return home. He suspected she traveled light, but he couldn't know. She'd have to speak first. Shaking his head, he climbed behind the wheel of his pickup and drove down the gravel road toward the red barn. With one Bluetooth earpiece in, he tapped the steering wheel in time to his favorite music. He learned early on in his time on the ranch, over 11 years ago, that no one in Montana appreciated the Southern California ska punk scene quite the way he did. If he didn't want to listen to the ranchers complain about his taste, he couldn't blast the songs he knew by heart on the stereo. As a transplant from the farming belt in the heart of the Golden State, however, he kept what ties he could to the hometown he had once imagined he'd never leave. He hadn't been back for a year, the longest stretch he'd ever managed without a California sunset or a slice of his favorite pizza. He owed one spot in particular a visit. After he wrapped up the paperwork for the summer employees, he'd make a visit. It'd have to be a quick before the chance of snow hung heavy in the air in about a month. His sister and niece were the only relatives left in their hometown. Earlier in the summer, he'd floated the idea about relocating to Herd. She hadn't said anything in response. Oh well. His reasons for visiting wouldn't change if she moved, and neither would his hurt lessen. He wanted her nearby. As far as little sisters went, she wasn't too terribly annoying, and her daughter was his favorite person on earth, which almost made his sister's bratty years worthwhile. He pulled the truck to the side of the barn and parked. Jumping to the ground, he pocketed his earpiece and shielded his gaze with one hand. The wooden structure was overdue for a coat of paint, but would have to wait a little while longer. He saw no point in doing a job twice. If the owners moved forward with the deck addition, the barn would be plenty beat up during construction. Cutting a giant hole in the back wall and adding French doors guaranteed a touch-up job. Strolling toward the back of the building, he headed toward the deep, low rumble of a heated conversation. Maybe he spoke too soon. Progress couldn't be reached at an impasse. At the corner, he dropped his arm to his side and approached his bosses, both equal owners, the 89-year-old legacy rancher and his 39-year-old grandson, scowling at each other in symmetry, like they were mirror twins. Ah, good. Sense has arrived. Come over here, Ted. Help me explain my side, Hank, the octogenarian, called. Ryan rolled his eyes heavenward and dug the toe of his boot into the dirt. Ted wasn't sure he counted as good advice, but he always urged caution. Taking risks was Ryan's forte and how the ranch prospered. Ted needed time to warm to one of the new ideas, but ended up in full support. What's the problem? Didn't we work out the deck size and position? I have the crew coming to pour footers. I have permits. We are scheduled and ready to start. I think we're wasting an opportunity here, Hank said. This old barn has been fixed up more times than I could count. Why don't we raise the whole thing and build something modern? We keep adapting the structure to fit our needs. Let's take the opportunity to really build what we need. Ted widened his eyes. Shaking his head, he stared at the ground. If he'd had a guess about today's Kincaid intergenerational debate, he wouldn't have used it on this topic. Demolishing a piece of ranch history? And Hank being the one to lead the destruction? When Ryan had first broached the idea of selling the cattle and appealing to tourists, he had waged a war with his grandsire, battling to change a single speck of dirt on the land. Ted knew. He'd been part of many of those arguments. Now, Hank wanted to rip out the original barn? Anyone who thought a person couldn't change was past a certain age was a fool. Mr. Kincaid, sir, are you serious? Ha! Ryan pointed to the cowboy. See, told you he'd be on my side. I don't want to come between you two, Ted said slowly, drawing the words out to give his brain a chance to catch up. I know better. Grandfather and grandson were equally matched when it came to stubbornness. Only the girl next door, Ryan's girlfriend, Meg Hawk, could cure either of their pig-headed ways. The Kincaid men shared a blind spot for her. She could do almost no wrong. What would she think about the new idea? Mr. Kincaid, you're right, Ted said, stroking his jaw. It would be great to have a clean slate. We'll be scrambling to retrofit the interior to meet the needs of the event guests and staff. Hank lifted his chin and grinned broadly at Ryan. But I agree with Ryan. Ryan clapped Ted's shoulder. Good man. Hank glowered. I'm not in favor of keeping the old barn forever. Ted held up his hands in surrender or defense, whichever proved the more effective stance against either or both of the Kincaids. You have a good point about the needs for an event. We squeeze into a tiny storage closet when we need something. We'll no doubt be storing at least double or more. Abby Witt has spoiled us about catering because she's on wheels. Her kitchen is parked outside and she hauls everything in as needed, Ted said. Hey, you're supposed to be talking up my plan, Ryan frowned. He didn't want to choose a side, and sometimes the stubborn pair insisted on all or nothing. The biggest argument to keep the barn is simple. We can't risk losing time during the start of the summer season if the build goes long, and builds always go long. My thoughts exactly, Ryan said. We'll get a new barn, eventually. We have to know the events are going to pull in a profit first. Oh, they will. With Meg in charge, I don't doubt it. Hank extended a hand to his grandson. Ryan shook it with a smile. Hank was a gracious enough loser to admit defeat. Of course, he was also wily enough to include praise for Ryan's girlfriend. Sharp and nimble, Hank was a formidable ally or foe. Ted always kept his caution around Hank. I was heading inside to double check provisions for tomorrow night. I invited Stephanie after she handed in her key, Ted said. Good, good. Did Stephanie get out okay? Was she pleased with working for us this season? Ryan said. Ted stroked his jaw. I think so. Not like she'd tell me. Ryan chuckled. Yeah, why do you have to be so scary all the time? You don't have to inspire fear to earn your employees' respect. Ted scowled. He couldn't take the joke for fear of the truth hidden in the jest. Was he intimidating? The ranch was his first experience as a boss. He didn't want anyone frightened of him. Oh, give the man a break, Hank interjected. Not his fault the woman clams up around him. It is peculiar, though. Ted agreed. She was a puzzle. He admired her spunk and bubbly personality. He glimpsed her beaming smiles directed at others. Whenever he neared, however, he heard nothing. He supposed it shouldn't matter, but it did. He could fight his own battles, but he was always grateful for a reprieve, especially about Stephanie. All he wanted out of life was to keep the status quo until he reached the end. He was most definitely not looking for romance and kept his guard up around his matchmaking elder boss. With so many years between himself and Stephanie, they'd have nothing in common and no reason to interact besides work. If he was going to pursue a friendship with someone, however, he might choose her. As the silence stretched, Ted became aware of the collective stare of his bosses. He cleared his throat. She did a nice job. Hopefully she'll be back. Ryan nodded. Wait a second. Scrunching his face, he turned to his grandfather. Why is he a man and I'm a boy? Hank shrugged. I never had to wipe his butt. Ted smiled at Ryan's red cheeks. Not a lot could embarrass him, but Hank knew every touch point. While the pair weren't Ted's family by blood, he was glad they'd embraced him anyway. Tragedy spurred him to uproot his life and change everything he'd ever known. Where he landed was just about perfect. With the opportunity to work with animals again next spring, he couldn't ask for more. He wanted everything to stay perfectly the same forever.